Good morning. I am Dan Cheeley, the Executive Director of the University of Pennsylvania's Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society, PRRUCS. I'm also the Director of the Collegium Institute. On behalf of PRRUCS, Collegium, and Penn's Fox Leadership International Program, FLI, I welcome you to our special event on the state of religious freedom, a 2021 global survey. Today's event is the second part of a four-part series on global religion this spring, which is a new joint programming initiative of PRRUCS and FLI. It began 2 weeks ago with Philip Jenkins' keynote lecture on the future of religion after the pandemic, which you can view on our YouTube channel, which we will post in the chat. The next two will address the role of transnational religious organizations in addressing public health crises and the past, present, and future of state-supported faith-based initiatives in America. Please stay tuned for a preview of the next event in this series at the conclusion of our program today. Today's event was made possible by the new PHL Fund, which will sustain PRRUCS through 2030. That fund was endowed by three generous Penn alumni, whom it's our honor to name here: James N. Perry, Francis Hager, and Vincenzo LaRuffa. We would like to thank them, as well as the co-sponsors for our event this morning. These co-sponsors include the Archbridge Institute, the Baylor Institute for Studies of Religion, the Fordham Center on Religion and Culture, the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies, the University College Dublin Newman Center for the Study of Religions, and the Religious Freedom Institute's Freedom of Religious Institutions in Society project. So, in our series on global religion, perhaps a session on global religious freedom requires no special explanation. Religious groups, as we know, do not exist in a vacuum, and religious practice is conditioned by both historical developments and present circumstances. We surveyed many of both in our first session with Professor Jenkins, focusing on longer-term demographic trends and fertility rates, together with changing cultural mores and digital landscapes. Less central to that first session, however, was politics. We will take that up here, exploring the present state of institutional frameworks that support or restrain religious practice worldwide. And it's just about the time of the spring that the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom releases its annual report on the state of the world. So here we are sneaking out before them. And there's much to anticipate with the new report. For with the 2020 report released early last spring, there was something missing, of course, that would dominate our attention afterward. I did a Control F search for the 100 plus pages in the report and returned no hits for pandemic, none for corona, none for COVID. For the first two millennia of the Common Era, plagues have summoned religion. On their way out of this life, the sick have sought divine solace for the afterlife, and they have been accompanied by women and men inspired by religion to be their caretakers. This past year, however, religion has been re-envisioned in many quarters as part of a public health problem. What implications does that have for the future of religious freedom? Must communities hereafter confront a difficult decision to make themselves either safe for religion or safe from it? This particular question is quite familiar to American politics. After all, avoidance of religious repression and the pursuit of religious freedom was considered a fundamental principle of the project of the United States in its self-conception as a novo ordo secularum, a new order of the ages. Vigilance over this first freedom or First Amendment remains characteristic here, even if far less consensual than in years past. But how does this issue in the United States look different when approached from a global perspective? In what parts of the world is religious freedom progressing and where is it diminishing? And how does that question relate to other issues of human rights, global justice, and the common good? That is, how concerned should all citizens be, religious or not, about religious freedom and what can be done? These questions will be considered by our multi-faith panel of leading thinkers, activists, and international field workers, whose impressive biographies we will paste into our chat box in order to not steal more time from them than I already have done. Instead, I will more simply identify them all now together. And then each one will offer opening remarks of 5 to 10 minutes before we transition to a moderated conversation followed by Q&A. If you would like to submit a question, please feel free to type it into the Q&A box at any time, and we will address as many as possible when we get to that moment of the event. So, in order of opening remarks, for the abbreviated introductions, first we will have Dr. Danielle Mark, who is former commissioner and vice chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and is currently an assistant professor of political science at Villanova University. He's also a member of the board of directors of the Jewish Coalition for Religious Liberty. Second will be Dr. Jacqueline Rivers, who is executive director of the Seymour Institute on Black Church and Policy Studies. She is a Hutchins Fellow in the W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute at Harvard University, and she serves on the board of advisors for the Religious Freedom Institute. Third is Dr. Firdaus Jahan, who is Senior Social Development Specialist at the World Bank. Currently based in Bangkok, Thailand, she was formerly Associate Director of Fox Leadership International at the University of Pennsylvania. Fourth and finally, Dr. Timothy Shah is a Senior Research Fellow of the Archbridge Institute and currently based in Bangalore, India. He was the architect of the Freedom of Religious Institutions and Society project and has authored and edited numerous books, including most recently, Homo Religiosus, Exploring the Roots of Religion and Religious Freedom and Human Experience. So then, without further ado, allow me to first welcome Dr. Danielle Mark.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome again, or good evening, or good afternoon, or wherever. I know that we have people from all around the world participating. I want to thank PRRUCS, Dan Cheely, Emmy Brown, all of the sponsors, everyone involved. Thank you so much for having me here and for having this great panel and for putting me with a group of such esteemed fellow panelists. I'm very excited to be the least of all the panelists. As you heard, my name is Danielle Mark. I teach at Villanova University, and from 2014 to 2018, I served on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, eventually as vice chairman and then chairman in my final year. Now, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF as we call it for short, that's USCIRF, is a 9-member independent bipartisan commission appointed, some members by Congress and some by the president. And the job of USCIRF is to advise the US government, that's the White House, the State Department, and Congress, on international religious freedom, and especially how US policy can help promote international religious freedom. And so in that respect, USCIRF is an advisory body, but there's another respect in which we also like to think of ourselves as a watchdog. And that's because in our dealings with foreign governments, we try to hold them to account with respect to religious freedom in their countries. And even more directly, we try to hold our own country to account, hold our own government to account here in the United States when it comes to promoting religious freedom abroad. Now, the challenge there is that, as anyone can easily understand, there are many, many priorities in US foreign policy. There are all kinds of political priorities, economic priorities, military priorities, all sorts of things that compete for pride of place in US foreign policy. And our job, in part, on USERF was to elevate international religious freedom as a priority, to make sure that the religious freedom of people around the world is not being lost in America's dealings with other countries around the world. Now, there's a phrase that may be familiar to some of you, that politics stops at the water's edge when it comes to different things in international affairs, that whatever disagreements, say, Republicans and Democrats might have here in the United States, that we set those disagreements aside when we go abroad, whether that's on a military expedition or a diplomatic one. And I always would have thought, going into this kind of work, and many have asked me on the same assumption, that international religious freedom would be a water's edge issue. The idea that once we go abroad, Republicans and Democrats and people of all stripes from America could be united in promoting the religious freedom of people outside the United States. Excuse me. But what I learned very quickly in working on USERF is that there are a lot of challenges. And I want to highlight 3 categories of challenges in particular. Of necessity, this will be very, very abbreviated for these brief introductory remarks. But I want to talk about 3 particular challenges that I encountered in doing this work on USERF, on the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. The first I'll call ideological. That as much as we might agree as Americans that people outside of America should also have religious freedom, there really is a big ideological or philosophical disagreement about how much religious freedom really matters, or even for some, does it matter? Is religious freedom just kind of one right among a family of human rights with no particular importance with respect to any of the others? Or is it even less important than some of the other human rights that are popular now, that America sometimes champions in its foreign policy? So does religious freedom matter, and how much? And even on our 9-member commission, there could be very big disagreements about whether, and believe it or not, even on a commission focused on religious freedom, on whether we should be pushing religious freedom ahead, even as we might not, because of our mandate, give similar attention to other rights or other so-called rights. A second category is what I might call the prudential category. Now, there are, even among people who agree on the importance of religious freedom or the nature of religious freedom, there's plenty of room for disagreement about how to go about promoting it. And again, to oversimplify, on one hand, we can take the approach that's known as naming and shaming, calling out the worst violators of religious freedom and really trying to use international pressure, and pressure specifically from the United States, of course, to try to promote religious freedom in the policies of that foreign government. But others at times would argue that we should not engage in naming and shaming, that might only cause our opponents or adversaries to entrench their own positions. Instead, we should engage in quiet backdoor diplomacy. Now, I personally always like to describe myself as an all of the above person, and that it takes prudential judgment to decide on a case-by-case basis about what to do. I think the problem I found is that we encounter people who thought there was never a place for the name, always thought the solution was quiet backdoor diplomacy. Now, unfortunately, in the USERF annual report that Dr. Chile was so kind to mention, USERF focuses on the worst countries and the worst non-state actors in the world for religious freedom. And they're the worst for a reason. If they were amenable to changing their ways when we ask nicely, we probably wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. And so, of course, I think there's a place for lots of different approaches, but I worry that those who think that quiet backdoor diplomacy is always the answer are actually making excuses for not getting the job done. And the third category is the partisan issue. All of us on the commission were collectively our own bosses, and we had people in Congress or the president in the White House who appointed us, but we didn't, in any strict sense, answer to anyone. And yet, naturally, some people will bring with them a partisan agenda, in which case one of the questions that would loom over our debates over religious freedom and how to promote it would be whose policy agenda, whose political agenda are we protecting? For me, one of the toughest ones, as far as the most disturbing or troubling, was at a time that we wanted to say something publicly about the religious freedom violations of the regime in Iran. And that was at the time when I was on the commission that the United States under President Obama was also working on the Iran nuclear deal. And members of the commission didn't think it was appropriate for us to weigh in on the persecution of a Christian pastor in Iran, because that might be seen indirectly as weighing in against Obama's nuclear deal. And again, regardless of what one thinks about the nuclear deal, I don't think it's a good posture for the United States to completely back off on its advocacy for human rights and religious freedom when there are other things going on, because the very point of the commission is to promote religious freedom as a priority in American foreign policy, even amongst all the other competing priorities. Now, just to wrap up here, and I think those are really big challenges that, as great as it is, the United States is dedicated to that. There are a lot of reasons that it makes it very difficult to advise our own government, for us to advise our own government and to set good policies. And so just to close, I'll say one word. I did not spend a lot of time on the commission during the Trump administration, really just the first year and change. But I think it was a credit to the administration that the vice president was personally very engaged. The same was true for the Secretary of State, who held his first ever ministerial, collecting foreign ministers from around the world in Washington, D.C., that it was on religious freedom, and that it was also the first ever ministerial on religious freedom at all under any Secretary of State. It also, religious freedom dovetailed with the political agenda. Sometimes at the very end of the administration, we saw the declaration of genocide against the Uyghur Muslims in China, which went along with president's policy of being tough with China. And I guess, that which is harder, of course, with allies of the United States like India or Saudi Arabia. And so it's not a simple thing and not a straightforward thing, but it's especially good when the advocacy of religious freedom will dovetail with the political agenda. And now, of course, we are in the early months of the Biden administration. And I guess we will see, without making any predictions about whether the Biden administration will have the appetite to put the necessary political capital behind religious freedom to overcome some of the policy challenges that I outlined. So I'm pretty much out of my time here. So I'm going to stop there, and I am going to very, very gladly and with great honor turn it over to Dr. Jacqueline Rivers, who will be the next panelist.
Thank you very much, Danielle. I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you to Professor John J. Diulio Jr., our dear friend, who is the mastermind behind the program for research on religion and urban civil society. And thanks to Dr. Dan Chile for hosting this panel. I'm really honored to be here. I am kind of the odd person out. My focus is much more in the United States. I do have some thoughts about religious freedom in the global context, but what I'm really going to talk about is the role of the Black church in terms of religious freedom in the United States. And I want to talk a little bit about something I'm calling enacted religious freedom, because I think the most important impact on the Black church has not so much been claims around religious freedom, but actually what people have done with their religious freedom. And I wanted to look at it from two perspectives. How has it been a burden to African Americans? How's religious freedom been a benefit to African Americans? And then what are some possible implications of that? So this idea of enacted religious freedom, that people feel free to act on their deeply held religious beliefs, even if they don't make an overt claim about religious freedom, even if they don't invoke the term or claim constitutional rights, that they're acting on this belief that they can work out their deeply held religious beliefs. So millions of people in the US attend church every Sunday morning, and they assume they have the right to go. They act on their religious belief without concern. In North Korea, a Christian might not be in the same position, would not be able to say, I can just get up and go to church. That person might believe just as deeply as a Christian in the US that he or she ought to be in fellowship, worshiping together with other believers, but not feel free to act on that belief because of the political climate and the constraints there. So in America, you have Christians with enacted religious freedom. They're acting on that religious freedom without a second thought, whereas someone in North Korea might be denied the enacted religious freedom. Another concept that I'd like to think about in this context is the key association between religion and different ethnic and racial groups. So Robert Putnam in American Grace writes about the close link between ethnicity and religion in the US. For example, he points to a high correlation between areas in which Lutheranism is prevalent and areas in which people of German descent live. And he finds that it's also important in identity formation, that people to whom religion is important, for them ethnicity is also important. And this is especially true in the Black church. All the studies done by Pew Center for Research, the latest one, which was just published in January of this year, find that African Americans are extremely devout, probably the most devout racial or ethnic group in the country. They're also overwhelmingly democratic, unlike most other conservative religious groups. So this distinctiveness of their religious experience influences how African Americans respond to religious freedom. Because religious freedom has in some ways been a burden for Black people in the United States. And the first and perhaps most shocking was actually the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, which were written in such a way that slaves were not allowed to sue for their freedom on the basis of English common law, which was a basis for these constitutions, and which held up to that point that Christians were prohibited from enslaving fellow Christians. So there was a very deliberate effort on the part of John Locke to ensure that slaves could not use their Christian faith to escape slavery, even as he asserted that they had the right, they had religious freedom. He was denying them what was then commonly the right to sue for freedom. But what is equally troubling in the slavery period was not just the way in which religious freedom itself was defined and applied, but also the way it was enacted. Because religion, according to Elizabeth Fox Genovese and Eugene Genovese, religion was the sine qua non for the South's defense of slavery. It was the most important thing that they were using to try and justify a system of human bondage. Reverend Thornton Stringfellow, a Baptist in the slave South, made many arguments that used religion as a justification for slavery. The most notorious probably was the idea that there was a curse, the curse of Ham, that Africans were descendants of Ham and that they'd been cursed by God and by Noah with the Hamitic curse. Also, he argued that God had sanctioned slavery in the 10 Commandments, that Abram and the Israelite patriarchs were slaveholders. So on the basis of this argument, slavery was being promoted. And so white Southerners were acting on their religious beliefs, this enacted religious freedom, and they saw that as their religious right to enslave Africans. But it doesn't end just with slavery. Tisa Wenger, in her book, points out that during World War II, the Joint Baptist Committee on Public Affairs refused to champion racial justice, even though Black Baptist churches, which had just been admitted to the Joint Committee, were requesting that they do this. They refused on the basis of their interest in religious freedom. They're like, we're going to focus on religious freedom. So while they didn't deny the request outright, they refused to actually make it a serious agenda item. Similarly, or even worse, a leading segregationist, Donald Richburg, argued that when President Harry Truman proposed the Federal Fair Employment Practices Act of 1948, which would have required whites to hire Blacks without discrimination, Richburg argued that this would have infringed on white Southerners' sincerely held religious beliefs that segregation was divinely ordained. So this was actually a direct appeal to religious freedom, which was used against Blacks. So in a lot of ways, religious freedom was a burden for Blacks, not just in slavery, but even beyond. But it was also a real benefit for Black Americans. Abolitionism was fundamentally associated with Christianity. Coming out of the Second Great Awakening, slavery was seen as contrary by those who were caught up in the Great Awakening, by many, as contrary to Jesus' teaching on the brotherhood of man, and that all men, all human beings were created in the image of God. So there was this passionate belief that slavery was wrong based on religious conviction. Abolitionist George Cheever described the struggle over slavery as a battleground of God's authority against a spirit of conquest and covetousness. So in the same way in which religion was being mobilized to promote slavery, it was mobilized powerfully by abolitionists against slavery. And Black people asserted their religious freedom, again, more by action than necessarily by a specific claim. In the formation of Black denominations, it is in action. Bishop Richard Allen led free Blacks out of white Methodist Episcopalian Church in Philadelphia when they resisted the imposition of segregation. And they went on to form not only their own church, but ultimately their own denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. They were acting on deeply held religious beliefs. This is their enacted religious freedom. Other Black denominations followed suit. For example, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, the Colored Methodist Church. And so these were actually cases where African Americans were acting on religious belief, exercising religious freedom. And this was true not just for Christianity, but also for other heterodox forms of religion among African Americans, the Moorish Science Temple, Father Divine's Peace Mission Movement, and many others. But the most impressive use of religious freedom by African Americans in their history, in addition to their participation in resisting slavery, was in the civil rights movement, which was a massive act of enacted religious freedom. Thousands of African Americans acted on their religious convictions about equality and asserted their freedom to do so despite the racist actions of the authorities. So Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was a leading figure in this movement, and it was really motivated by very deeply held faith commitments. But he was not the only one. I mean, King could never have done this, as brilliant as he was and as committed as he was, could never have done this on his own. It was really the shock troops of the civil rights movement, thousands of faithful churchgoers who would meet late into the night, singing songs of praise and listening to rousing sermons, really getting the courage to go out and face police dogs and fire hoses and policemen with batons, really drawing on their faith and enacting their faith in resisting segregation and racial oppression. And of course, these weren't only Christians. There were many people of Jewish faith, no faith at all, who participated in the civil rights movement, who were acting on their freedom of conscience, which is so closely linked to religious freedom. Today, the Black church continues to use its religious freedom to serve the poorest among us. We are famous for Black churches for constructing affordable housing, especially for the elderly, running programs for food distribution to the poor, establishing schools and after-school programs to educate our young. And in fact, in one nationally representative sample of 7 denominations, it found that over 90% of Black churches provide youth services for their neighbors, 75% or more provide cash assistance, voter registration, and or a food pantry, and at least 50% offer counseling. In another study, found that in Philadelphia, Black congregations provided over $90 million in free services annually to their community. So religious freedom, in a few cases, literal claims on religious freedom, but in many more cases, enacted religious freedom, people acting on deeply held religious beliefs, both Black people and white people, has profoundly impacted African Americans, both as a burden and as a benefit. But in many cases, when white Southern Christians have enacted their religious freedom or made claims of religious freedom, it has been to buttress the right to discriminate against Blacks and to block efforts to pursue racial justice. And this has really been alienated for African Americans. In addition, Southern whites are highly vocal and are the very visible champions of religious freedom in the United States. I want to also harken back to the fact that African Americans are so heavily identify themselves as democratic, while many of those who are championing religious freedom and many white Southerners are heavily identified as Republican. These two factors have worked to somewhat marginalize the Black church in the struggle for religious freedom in the United States, which is increasingly important. It was once taken for granted. It is no longer to be assumed that religious freedom, despite being a constitutionally protected freedom, that it is in fact readily available in all cases, that it is going to win the day. So in this era of declining receptivity to claims of religious freedom, it is troubling that the Black church is marginalized, is largely on the sidelines in this battle because of the kind of moral authority and moral standing that the Black church has in the country, especially in terms of our battle for civil rights and for racial justice. So that is a perspective from the Black church in the US. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Firdaus Jahan.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Diulio and Dan, for having me in this panel. And so before I start, I'd like to mention that I'm not representing the World Bank today here. And what I'm saying, it does not reflect any official position of the World Bank. So with that, I'm a Muslim living in a Buddhist country, that is Thailand. And I work in South Asian countries of Afghanistan, Bangladesh, India, Maldives, and Sri Lanka. So when it comes to the effects of pandemic on religion, the first thing that comes to my mind is that people in this part of the world are much more fatalistic than they were before the pandemic. Kind of a resignation, like what's happening is happening. So, and it means that people are like thinking, oh, I can't control anything in my life any longer. So everything is in God's hand. So this is something that we're seeing. So, and the public opinion and behaviors regarding the pandemic is quite different in these countries than that of the Western world. In East Asian countries in general and Thailand in specific, people religiously obey all public health instructions. They all wear masks. You will not find anyone in the street of Bangkok not wearing masks. Everybody maintain physical distancing, hours of operations for businesses, restaurants, everybody is following it. And what we have seen, the overall, the incidence of the COVID-19 infection and deaths are significantly lower in East Asian countries than that of North and South America, as well as European countries. And these countries, like one can say that these countries have very stable governance, like some are semi-authoritarian, making people listen to them. But more importantly, these countries really have excellent healthcare system and structure, and often I find them better than what we have in the US. So you can say that, oh, that's why they have low they're listening to people because of authoritarian government. And then they have good health system. So that's why they're doing good. But when it comes to South Asian countries, We know the governance is very weak and the healthcare system is very poor and with very low capacity. Yet the incidence of infections and deaths in these countries, though they are a bit more than East Asia, but they're a lot less than both Americas, North and South, and European countries. So there are many explanations. Scientists are trying to find why this is the case, but still we don't know exactly why this is happening. So when we cannot explain things, then we comfortably say that, oh, it's all in God's will. And pandemic is a punishment from God affecting the sinners. And then it's up to us and anyone to define who the sinners are. So when we hear this term of Chinese virus, or there's this recent killing of Asian American women in Atlanta, and all the statistics about hate crimes against Asians in the US, so I just want to share that what a politician in Thailand commented a while ago at the beginning of pandemic. He said, be aware of the white foreigners. They are dirty people. They don't wash themselves properly, don't wear masks, and they spread COVID. On the other hand, one Muslim clergy in Bangladesh, he emphatically announced that Allah has punished the Chinese people with COVID because of their genocide of the Uyghur Muslims. So these actually are examples that show that how the religion is used, religion and pandemic, they're being used politically in all our countries, leading to racism, hatred. And they're actually infused and by legitimacy by clergies and political elites. So overall, in most of these countries, we find the religious freedom only is there for the religion of the powerful and the majorities. The people belonging to minority religion, for example, Muslims in Thailand, or Christians in Thailand, or Hindu or Christians in Bangladesh, for them, the space is really, really shrinking. However, this is one side of the story. But there are other examples, like we can see that how religion can actually be separated from public health and how both religion and public health can coexist. And this is a story I'm going to share with you. This is a story of making the population problem into a public health problem and keeping religion out of it. So I kind of came up with the idea when I was listening to Professor Jenkins' session from the last session that we had, and when he discusses about fertility and religiosity. And he says that there is a very strong correlation between the fertility rate in a society and its degree of religious involvement and activism and the strength of organized and institutional religion. So then I kept, as a child, I grew up in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And since my childhood in early 70s and 80s, family planning campaign has been at the center of development effort of the country, both by the government and the development partners. Bangladesh has 57,000 square miles of land and 170 million people live in that country. And the population density is almost 3,000 people per square mile. Just to put it in the perspective, Pennsylvania has 46,000 square miles of land with a population of 12.7 million. So you can see that this is quite a common sense for Bangladesh that they need to do it's a necessity to do the population control. So with that, so the country invested heavily in family planning, and the results have been simply amazing. According to the latest UN data, the total fertility rate in 1970 was 6.91. That means that like 6.91 children being born per woman. And guess what? Today, that rate is only 1.97. So while we have done really well in terms of family planning, in the political sphere, the country started as a secular country, Then gradually and eventually we moved towards Islamization. And in 1988, Islam was announced as the state religion. And you will find a lot more women wearing hijabs in Bangladesh than they did in the past. So that's the kind of country context. So when I came to the US in 1999, that is the first time I was exposed to this abortion debate. And then I was scratching my head and thinking, why didn't I confront this issue, this debate in Bangladesh? Nobody talks about it. So I decided to write a paper for one of my course on family planning campaign in Bangladesh. And what I found, like the key messages, the key findings that I had from my research for that paper, term paper, is that use of birth control methods is a common knowledge in Bangladesh. Almost all women, mainly, and some men use birth control methods. And no religious leaders speaks against birth control. However, the most fascinating finding for me that abortion in Bangladesh is very common. It's cheap, it's free, and it's not called abortion. It's called MR. That means menstruation regulation. That's the term. So we termed it as something is wrong with me as my period stopped and I need to go to doctor to get it regulated. And if you find, like this first, if you try to do a Google search on this issue, it says under Bangladesh's Penal Code of 1860, induced abortion is illegal except to save a woman's life. Menstruation regulation, however, has been part of Bangladesh's National Family Planning Program since 1979. And MR is allowed up to 12 weeks of pregnancy. In any parts of the country, one will find health clinics and hospitals where a woman can go, walk in, and get her MR done without any questions asked. Because it is a family planning method, it is not an abortion. So this example actually shows how government can legitimize a seriously contested issue when it is supported by the society, which is derived from the necessity. And as I mentioned earlier, religious extremism and religiosity of people have been on the rise in the country. More women are wearing hijabs, more people are opting for Islamic banking than ever. Institutions are very powerful. So this example actually tells me that in many developing countries, most probably religion is safe even in the face of pandemic being considered and dealt as a public health issue. So I'll stop there and I'll invite Dr. Tim Shah, the next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Jahan. It's a great pleasure to be part of this discussion. I warmly thank the Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society and the Collegium Institute for sponsoring the panel and inviting me to participate. And I thank Dan Sheely for reaching out to me. And I pray that somehow the benevolent presence of John DiIulio is with us somehow, even if he may not actually be able to join us for this webinar. I feel special affection for John and Dan and the Collegium Institute as they provided a wonderful intellectual home for one particular UPenn sophomore, my daughter Miriam, who is a faithful member of the Collegium family and I believe is tuning into this webinar. I'm also very proud that initiatives in which I'm involved, the Archbridge Institute, the Religious Freedom Institute's Freedom of Religious Institutions and Society, or FOREST project, and the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies are co-sponsoring this event. In my very brief cleanup remarks at the end of this panel, I'm going to focus on three questions. First, what is the overall state of religious freedom here in Asia, where I am speaking to you from, where I focused my own work for some 20 years, and especially for the last 5 years? Second, what positive trends stand out here in Asia? We focus a lot on the negative when we talk about global religious freedom, rightly so. but we need to also focus on positive trends that might give us a bit of encouragement, as well as might provide replicable models that could be applied elsewhere. Finally, what conceptual and strategic lessons can we draw from Asia's positive trends that might help us improve our understanding of what religious freedom is, as well as how to promote religious freedom effectively? So first, what is the overall state of religious freedom here in Asia? And I'm going to share my screen. I have a few slides that I'd like to share. Just a few. Those of you who are more technologically competent than I will not be impressed by my technological brilliance, but perhaps this will just help provide cues to the audience and help you follow my remarks. So first, what is the overall state of religious freedom here in Asia? The state of religious freedom in Asia is of massive global importance because the region where I am in and where Firdaus Jahan is in contains more than 50% of the world's population, and several of the most important global powers, China, India, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, among others. The Indo-Pacific region, which you can see in the circle on the map, in fact contains more people than within that circle than are outside of that circle. So this is a massively important global region. And if we look at what's happening in this region in terms of religious freedom, we can say that the trends are not encouraging, to say the least, for several key reasons. First, the most powerful country in Asia, China, is perfecting a form of techno-totalitarianism that is perhaps the greatest threat to religious freedom that the world has seen since the rise of fascist and communist totalitarianism in the early 20th century. Though first introduced in China's Xinjiang province as a means of policing its mostly Muslim Uyghur population, the elements of the Chinese Communist Party's surveillance state are rapidly being introduced across this entire nation of 1.4 billion people. One element is the proliferation of highly sophisticated security cameras and data scanners. In Urumqi, Xinjiang's capital, police installed more than 18,000 facial recognition cameras covering about 3,500 of the city's residential complexes. And China as a whole reportedly, as of 2019, had something like 170 million security cameras. That's more than one camera for every 10 people in China. Using special apps on their smartphones, police can upload the data that they collect to shared analytical platforms, which then cross-tabulate the collected data and flag individuals who, for example, frequently engage in religious activity. Another element of China's surveillance state is a social credit system. While there is presently no nationwide social credit system across China, several major municipalities, including Beijing, have instituted schemes whereby individuals accumulate reputational points based on their good and bad behavior. Bad behavior can include visiting houses of worship too frequently, or failing to help the police identify religious dissidents, such as members of Falun Gong. Low social credit scores can be disastrous, making it impossible for individuals to secure places for their children in desirable schools or to be able to purchase plane or train tickets. The Communist Party aspires to impose a social credit system unified across the entire country of China. Two things about China's high-tech leviathan are particularly troubling and demand our attention. First, rapidly developing technology means that it is inevitable that the system will become much more sophisticated and comprehensive in the coming years, enveloping all of China in a repressive panopticon that few science fiction writers have even been capable of imagining. Second, China is taking great pains to export elements of its techno-totalitarianism to other countries within its growing sphere of influence, countries such as its neighbors in Central Asia and Pakistan. Alongside an expansionist techno-totalitarian China, two other trends make the religious freedom situation in Asia alarming. One is the continuing spread of transnational Islamism, and second is the rise of ethno-religious nationalism. In terms of transnational Islamism, by far the worst single act of religious violence perpetrated against any religious community in Asia, to my knowledge, in recent years, was the Islamist terrorist suicide attack in Sri Lanka on Easter Sunday 2019, in which 3 Christian churches and 3 hotels in Colombo were targeted, killing 267 people and injuring some 500. Furthermore, several Asian countries, including Pakistan, Bangladesh, Malaysia, and the Maldives, are witness to various forms of Islamism that repress religious freedom, either from the top down through official state action or from the bottom up through the sometimes violent extremism of non-state actors, or both. Ethno-religious nationalism, on the other hand, tells individuals in many countries in Asia that their identity, their primary identity, comes from their belonging to a great nation, defined by a unique confluence of religion, race, language, and territory. Such movements appear to be seeing their greatest growth in Asia. Ethno-religious nationalist movements are burgeoning in Buddhist-majority Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Thailand, as well as in Hindu-majority Nepal and India. Those Asian countries that are in the grip of extreme forms of ethno-religious nationalism risk a combination of democratic backsliding and religious repression. Even worse, these dynamics, techno-totalitarianism, ethno-religious nationalism, and transnational Islamism, amplify each other in a destructive, vicious cycle. For example, the steady rise in anti-Muslim rhetoric and violence on the part of Buddhist extremists in Sri Lanka ever since the end of the country's civil war in 2009 appears to have played a role in radicalizing those individuals who were responsible for the 2019 Easter attacks. In turn, the Islamist terrorist attacks themselves played a powerful role in throwing further fuel on the fire of extremist Buddhist nationalism, paving the way for massive electoral victories by Sinhalese Buddhist nationalists in late 2019 and mid-2020. And the increasingly authoritarian Sri Lankan government, now dominated by these nationalists, is in turn imposing even more repressive measures as we speak on its Muslim minority, measures that are taken right out of China's totalitarian playbook. Against this bleak picture, I turn to my second question, because given this bleak picture, we might well ask, are there any positive trends here in Asia, which might give us a bit of encouragement, as well as potentially replicable models and practices? I can summarize the most important positive trends I believe are significant in one word, and that is Indonesia. Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim majority nation, the world's 3rd largest democracy, and the 4th most populous country with about 275 million people. It is also the only Muslim majority country on earth, to my knowledge, whose minority Christian community has significantly grown. In fact, it has tripled as a proportion of the population and in social influence since the early 20th century, in stark contrast to many, many Muslim majority countries, Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, to name a few, where the Christian population has plummeted. Indonesia is far from perfect, but it is moving decisively and remarkably against all the discouraging trends that are increasingly afflicting so many other Asian countries. For example, a ruling by Indonesia's Constitutional Court in 2017 extended religious freedom protections to indigenous spiritual traditions outside the country's 6 officially recognized religions. In addition, the wave of Islamist mobilization that brought down the Christian governor of Jakarta in 2017 failed ultimately to defeat the country's moderate president, Joko Widodo, in Indonesia's national elections in 2019. Indeed, the display of Islamist power in 2017 has prompted Indonesian political and religious leaders to double down on the country's political and cultural traditions of religious tolerance. Most recently, in a development that attracted global attention, you can see the headline in the New York Times on the slide, the government of Indonesia has just issued a decree, which took effect this month, ordering public schools to respect religious freedom and prohibiting them from enforcing religious-based dress codes on girls. The decree was held up by Indonesia's recently appointed Minister of Religious Affairs, Yakut Khalil Kumas, as a reaffirmation of Indonesia's status as a tolerant and pluralist nation. This is a photograph of the newly appointed Minister of Religious Affairs, who was partly responsible for this new reform. Now, what conceptual and strategic lessons can we draw from Indonesia's positive example that might help us improve our understanding of what religious freedom is, as well as how to promote religious freedom effectively? Though many factors are at work, my own analysis indicates that one crucial reason that Indonesia is a relative bright spot on Asia's relatively bleak religious freedom landscape is a single civil society organization, the Nahdlatul Ulama, which means awakening of scholars. Now the largest mass Islamic organization in the world with some 90 million followers, the Nahdlatul Ulama was founded nearly a century ago in 1926, almost simultaneously, interestingly, with the Muslim Brotherhood founded in 1925 in Egypt. However, while the Muslim Brotherhood and its numerous ideological offspring, such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, have consistently pursued militant and anti-pluralist and supremacist agendas with fateful consequences for many countries in the Muslim world, the Nahdlatul Ulama has become an increasingly robust advocate of a distinctively Indonesian, indigenous vision of religious freedom. In particular, Nahdlatul Ulama illustrates the proposition that the more religious institutions and organizations are free from arbitrary state repression, the more they are free to innovate, to develop according to their own spiritual logic, and ultimately to serve society. This is the proposition that underlies the Freedom of Religious Institutions and Society Forest project that I launched at the Religious Freedom Institute in 2019. Ever since its founding, the Nahdlatul Ulama has been independent, self-organizing, and free of government control. In fact, it's a pre-political organization in that it was founded before Indonesia even became an independent state. It has participated in every major phase of Indonesia's modern history and consistently determined outcomes as an independent actor, including the establishment of Indonesia as a multi-religious and pluralistic nation state in 1945, the defeat of Dutch colonialism in 1949, and Indonesia's successful transition to democracy in the late 1990s. Nahdlatul Ulama's institutional independence and deeply rooted theological commitment to the common good have enabled it to develop an effective organization capable of promoting Indonesia's indigenous traditions of religious tolerance. In fact, the Indonesian Minister of Religious Affairs, who was instrumental in prohibiting public schools from imposing religious dress on their students, Yakut Kumas, again pictured here, emerged from the senior leadership and traditions of Nahdlatul Ulama, and in fact served as the Nahdlatul Ulama's young adult movement leader immediately before becoming Minister of Religious Affairs. The lesson, I think, from this positive trend in Indonesia is clear. Religious freedom analysts and advocates should pay more attention to the institutional dimensions of religious freedom, i.e. the freedom of religious organizations, such as Indonesia's Nahdlatul Ulama. The freedom of individuals and of individual conscience is, of course, indispensable and foundational, but with adequate independence and freedom to operate, religious organizations, religious communities, religious institutions can be powerful carriers of indigenous traditions of religious tolerance, as well as bulwarks, shields for the freedom of individuals who would otherwise often be helpless in the face of governments aspiring to impose Orwellian levels of surveillance and control in our grim new era of techno-totalitarianism. Thanks very much.